Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about Muammar al-Gaddafi. Who is Gaddafi? He was one of the most controversial and complex political figures in the modern era of Africa. But to most and to some, he was a bold leader who tried to free Libya from their foreign control, lift up their poor, and to create a totally new form of a political system. But to others, he was a self-centered dictator who built a massive security state, silenced his opponents, and damaged their political institutions for decades. What makes Gaddafi particularly fascinating is that both images contain some sort of truth to his life, and this cannot be summarized in simple terms because his rule was 42 years, and this blends a lot of things together. It blends his ideals, the contradictions he had, his achievements he had, and then some ways he abused his leadership that other leaders haven't had the chance to do. We're also going to talk about how in 1969 he came to rise to power, and then his ideology through his green book that he created. In 1942, Gaddafi was born in a coastal city near Sirte, and his family belonged to the Qaddafi tribe, and they lived in Budan tents, which was very poor, very dirt poor. But unlike many later political figures, he did not come to the urban centers or the elite. He did not come from the urban centers or the elite schools or a political family, but instead he grew up in a tent in the desert, living in a very harsh lifestyle that revolved around herding animals and then surviving harsh conditions just to live. This upbringing helped shape his identity for the rest of his life, and he often portrayed himself as a man of the people or someone who had risen from poverty and hardship to lead the nation. This image became his foundation of his political doing, but also both inside Libya and on the outside world stage. So other leaders knew him like this as well, and it wasn't just in Libya. And then during his childhood, he was still dealing with some of the effects of the Italians' colonial rule, and which had ended a year after he was born, and the country was still industrially underdeveloped and socially divided and still politically fragile. Growing up, he would have witnessed poverty, limited education access, and a strong tribal traditions. These early experiences helped shape him in his deep distrust of Western powers and his desire to make Libya independent. One of the most influence had on Gaddafi was Nasser, which was the Egyptian president, and he was one of the pan-Arab nationalism, and the idea that Arab nations should unite under a shared unity really hit Gaddafi, and he wanted that for Libya as well at such a young age. And when he was just 14 in 1956, the Suez crisis erupted, and in which Nasser faced down Britain and France and Israel, and the crisis left a deep impression on Gaddafi, he saw Nasser as such a heroic symbol of the Arab pride and the independence and resistance it took to dominate a foreign force. From that moment on, he admired Nasser and wanted to be like him, but he also wanted to eliminate him so he could be better than him. Gaddafi later pursued military education as his pathway into the national leadership, and he attended the Benghazi Military Academy, and where he formed a small secret group of officers who had shared the same ideas as him. And these officers believed that Libya was being poorly ruled by King Idris, which was the king at the time. And they saw him as an old, fragile, ineffective, overly friendly with the Western nations type of leader, and they didn't want that. And so this group would later become the core of the movement that brought Gaddafi his power in 1969. We'll talk about it now. So in 1969, on September 1st, 1969, Muammar Gaddafi and his fellow officers launched a very carefully planned, intended to be bloodless, while King Idris was out of the country for medical treatment. He was getting medical treatment a lot more frequent because he was getting older, and he would go to Turkey for these treatments. And people knew that he was leaving more to get medical treatments because he was getting sick, because he was getting older. And so they took this as like a time and an advantage, and it was very large, it was very peaceful, and it was very successful. And at just 27 years old, Gaddafi became the head of the Revolutionary Command Council, which is huge. Immediately after taking this power, he portrayed himself as a revolutionary rather than a traditional politician, and he took this inspiration from Egypt's Nasser, portraying his government as an anti-corruption, anti-imperialist, and deeply nationalistic. But he wore simple uniforms instead of royal robes, and he refused the title of president and instead wanted to be called the leader of the revolution, or a brotherly leader. And later into his ruling, he does start to dress a lot more like out there, and his uniforms are a lot more colorful, and so he becomes more like a figure that way, and he's known later for his colorful attire. And one of his first major actions was expelling the remaining foreign military bases from Libya and nationalizing their oil industry. Libya's oil was discovered shortly before the coup and became the foundation of Gaddafi's new state. By renegotiating these contracts with the foreign oil companies, he dramatically increased their national revenues, which he used to modernize the country. And that's how they got their hospitals and their schooling and their housing. Under his leadership in 1970, Libya saw rapid improvements of education, healthcare, housing, and infrastructure. Illiteracy dropped sharply and life expectancy rose, and government began building roads, hospitals, and schools across the nation, and not just in one area. During these early years, Gaddafi gained widespread support among Libyans. Mainly the poor and the rural population supported him the most, because they're going to be the people that ultimately should see the main benefits of his leadership. And so they supported him the absolute most. They worshiped the ground he walked on, and they tried their best to do their best for him. And then many people felt like for the first time their leader represented them and was using their wealth to help them and benefit them. But however, while these reforms strengthened his popularity, they also helped solidify his personal power over everybody. And Gaddafi presented his policies as a revolutionary act that only he could carry out and nobody else could, and that he was planting the seeds of a political system centered entirely on his own leadership. In the mid-1970s, Gaddafi began formalizing his political ideals and ideas into, it's a 3-part book, and it's known as the Green Book. And this book was a requirement for us in all schools and the government institutions during this time as he served. He wanted this to be the foundation of Libya's new political and social system, and so that is why he put these into the schools and the government institutions, is to try and get the word out there to everybody about what he was doing and what he wanted to see. And the Green Book didn't function just as a political manual, but it also became a tool for reshaping Libyan society as a cultural and psychological level, because their culture wasn't very strong at the time just because it was so divided, and then their psychological level, so their education, was not strong whatsoever. And so that's why it was huge that they got good schooling now, and the schools incorporated its ideas into their curriculum, and their public gatherings that often opened with reading from the chapters of this book. The book was printed in many different languages and distributed abroad as a part of Gaddafi's attempt to present himself as an international thinker, and that offering this third way between the East and the West during the Cold War. And however, outside Libya, the book was often criticized, and it was overly simplistic, and many scholars argue that its claims about direct democracy mask the reality of an ordinary Libyan who had little real influence. Still, the Green Book played a critical role in defining the political identity of Libyans and shaped the worldview of a generation of Libyans who grew up being told that their country had been invented a revolutionary political system unlike anything other in the world, because it was like getting told that this book was this way or the highway, everybody was doing it, it was so good, and so they thought that this was a one-in-a-lifetime thing. They were so blessed to be a part of it, and later they would find out that he did have good things about his ruling, but he also did have things that did not go so well. Going into his book, he talks about the political ideology, and his stance on that is that the traditional democracy was a fraud, and in his view, the parliaments, political parties, and elections allowed small elites to make decisions for the majority. And his solution was a direct democracy, which allowed the locals to have a voice and to let them vote. But he had the revolutionary committees, and they were very loyal to Gaddafi, and they guided these decisions to ensure that they were aligned with what Gaddafi wanted. And so the system, it looked very like it was everybody's involved. We want everybody to tell us like what they want, but it was ultimately like Gaddafi's way or the highway, and he had people who had his back to make sure it went his way, so things would go his way. His economic ideology was rejected of both capitalism and traditional socialism, and he argued that the wage labor was a form of modern day slavery, and believed that the workers should collectively own their means of production and not just like have it. And he discouraged private businesses, limited earnings, and promoted state-controlled economic planning. And along with this approach, this meant that it was to be created equally, and created inefficiency and stagnation in the long run. And as many people had incentives to innovate or manage businesses effectively, and so these people could not manage their businesses good because their workers were asking out like stuff from like more from them than they could give to them. And then there's his social ideology was that it focused on the cultural issues and the religion and the family structure that he believed in, and he blended the Islamic teachings with his tribal customs and some elements of of socialism. But he argued for women's education and participated in society while also reinforcing certain traditional expectations. So while he was still trying to get women to get their education, because at the time it was only men, he was also trying to reinforce these expectations he had of everybody else, so it didn't get like twisted that he was favoring one side and that it was both sides that needed to do it. His culture ideas, like the rest of the Green Book, reflected his personal beliefs, and it was pretty consistent with his ideological tradition. Overall, this was an attempt to create a unique and self-contained political philosophy that justified his ruling, and it allowed him to present his government as a revolutionary alternative to the both Western and Soviet communism, positioning himself as just a big global thinker, and he was a big innovator, which he was not. Gaddafi's legacy, he has a big legacy. He had a 42 year ruling, which is a very long time for a lot of things to happen. It was deeply divided, and his impact on Libya still remains visible even long after his death. And internationally, he left behind his legacy that extended beyond the Libyan borders. And throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, he positioned himself as a champion of anti-colonial movements, which was providing the financial and military support in groups in Africa and the Middle East, Asia, and even parts of Latin America. Some of these groups were independent movements that later formed legitimate governments, while others were militia organizations involved in violence, earning Gaddafi his reputation as a destabilizing actor on the world stage. His willingness to confront powerful nations, especially the United States and Western Europe, was made feared. It made him both feared, but also admired internationally. And by the 2000s, he attempted a partial diplomatic shift by negotiating the end of Libya's weapons of mass destruction program and reopening the economic relations in the West. This dramatic shift highlighted the unpredictability that he characterized so much during his ruling, and he could switch from like a revolutionary firebrand to a global negotiator depending on his political circumstances. And even today, some scholars still debate that whether his primary vision is primarily a visionary for a pan-Arab leader, pan-African leader, a reckless disruptor, and a violent mix of both. So he was very unpredictable. You didn't know what we were getting. He would depend his mood on who he was going to see. He would negotiate, however, depending on the circumstances, which is very, like, as a leader, you don't want that. And so it was very frustrating on the people when they were getting all these mixed signals. Some positives of his legacy was that after the first decade is when the oil wealth was dramatically improving, and it was improving living conditions for the poor and the ordinary, and their education and their healthcare became free, and literacy rates went high, and so everybody was understanding literacy. And the government built an extensive housing and infrastructure projects, and they also had the Great Man-Made River made during this time while Gaddafi was under rule. And it basically takes the fresh water from the desert and pumps it into the coastal cities, and it's still one of the largest water projects today. Some negatives that he had was, despite all these accomplishments, he also built a political system that depended almost entirely on his personal leadership, and he created an overlapping intelligence of networks that monitored his citizens, arrested his opponents, and eliminated political freedom. And his foreign policy, which included supporting militia groups and confrontations with Western nations, led to sanctions that damaged Libya's economy in the 1990s. The political institutions he had created were weak, and when he died, Libya lacked the structure they needed to transition smoothly into a new government, and the conflict that followed his overthrow in 2011 can be partially traced to the absence of a strong, independent institutions during his ruling. So overall, he made Libya politically fragile as well, and he had a very big impact on Libya, but through his 42-year rule, he shaped Libya in ways that were destructive, but also transformative. Through the oil was transformative. His rise to power in 1969 helped us mark the beginning of a new era, and one that defined the nationalist pride, rapid modernization, and unique political philosophy expressed through the Green Book. Yet his authoritarian tendencies, human rights abuses, and unpredictable foreign policy created long-term challenges that Libya still continues to face today. Thank you.